Okay, so we just were about to start Chaf Hey, so let's start that today. Hashomer Perot Tulushim Shelo Nigmar Melachtam Lamaaser. If a person is hired to watch over harvested produce, already harvested produce, but it has not been processed yet. Kagon, Gitos Yayin Va'aremas Chitim. So for example, you've got vats of wine, and I guess it's probably still in the process of fermenting, or piles of wheat. So in that situation, Rashai, we had said before that if you're just watching passively, the Torah does not award you the right to eat, to nibble on that produce. However, Rashai Hilchos Medina Shenagu Kain Avolomina Torah. So the government, in other words, I guess in the times of the Rav Shulchan Aruch, where, in Europe, in Eastern Europe, the government granted employees rights to snack on this kind of produce that he was watching over, but the Torah does not grant you that right. Shahashomer eno ka'osa ma'isa min hadin. So the reason is because someone who's just a security guard is not considered to be actively working with the produce, and therefore you really, by all rights, should not be allowed to sample the items. Ela shenahagu lahachashivo ka'osa ma'isa. It's just that's the minhag hamedina. That's become the accepted norm. And once something becomes a convention within society, then it becomes the law as far as these issues are concerned. The im mishamer peiros shel kama b'nei adam. And if a person is in charge of watching over multiple sets of produce that are owned by multiple individuals, lo yochal hakol mishel echad, ochel mishum mishel kulam, then he should not just nibble on one person's produce, but should try to distribute his sampling among all of his clients, and that's only fair. Lefi cheshbon, according to some calculation, or according to some calculus which fairly distributes how much he's going to eat from each person's harvest. Aval hashomer b'mechuber afilu b'shas lekitaso shalokte miruach zeh zu v'shomer b'ruach acheres ad sheyavo lilkot sham miyad eno ochel. He says, so all we've said up until now is if you're a guard over already harvested produce. But if you're watching over a field or a set of fields, and those fields all have stalks of wheat growing in them, or stalks or vines or whatever it is, so you're not allowed to nibble on it if you're just watching it. And even more than that, let's say you're working on the south side of the field actively harvesting, you're not allowed to, let's say you take a bathroom break, and then on your way back, you pass by the northern side of the field to get to the southern side. You're not allowed to take the produce from the northern side until you're actively working on the northern side. So those are two additional halachos that we've learned from here is that, number one, even though the Torah does not award a guard the rights for nibbling, but the minhag hamedina, the custom of society in his time, does permit it. And furthermore, permission is only actually three halachas. Permission is only granted for harvested produce, but not for still growing produce from the ground. And the third thing we learned is that when you're watching over multiple interests, then you should nibble within some kind of equity and divide up your nibbling from all of the people that you're watching over. Okay, so shelo nigmar melachtam lemaiser, but the produce has not yet been completed. In other words, it hasn't been fully processed. Avolim nigmara malachtan asr lechol klal gamim osamai samamish kidleil sitchav gimel. But once the produce has been fully processed and it's just waiting, let's say, for packaging or something like that, so then you're not allowed to nibble on it at all. Gitos yayin, he says, vats of wine. Why is the vat of wine not considered to be processed? He says, he says, because until it's removed from the vat and placed in barrels, it's not considered to be processed. The processing finishes once it's put in barrels for fermentation purposes. Okay? And kuf lamed zayin ba'aremas chitin b'zera shaylechol gam achar shenitzmarchu achitim v'nitzchayvu meiser kevin she'omdim lasus mehen pas kedel sitchav gimel. And when it comes to piles of wheat, remember we learned that you're allowed to continue nibbling on wheat kernels until they get ground up into flour and get mixed with water. So therefore, even if it's fully processed wheat kernels, it's still considered to be subject to the meiser of challah when it becomes dough, and therefore you're allowed to nibble on grain. And sha'ashomer eino ka'osa maisa, because a guard is not considered to be actively working. V'hatorah lo hitira lechol ela lepoel ha'osa maisa. The Torah only gives an award to a worker who's actively working, who's doing a physical act. But by being passive and sitting and just watching, that's not called an active work, and therefore you're only permitted this allowance because of societal norms. So that's the only reason. So this is a very quick halacha. There's no real groisa chidushim. There's nothing here that we really have to dwell on. Let's go on to the next halacha. Chavav. Acholev v'hamegabein eino ochel. A person who is a milkman. Now, by a milkman, we mean that he is a milker. He milks cows for a living, okay? Or he's a cheese maker. And so that's a person who works at a dairy, okay? Eino ochel. He does not get to sample the product. And the reason is shenemar bidisho, madayeshu gidule karka avkol gidule karka. And the basis for this is because the Torah says, do not muzzle an animal when he's in the threshing floor, which implies that we're dealing with produce that comes from the ground. So if it's not directly from the ground, it's not growing, but rather a product of an animal, so then you're not entitled to sample. V'chol ha'ochel ma she'en lo le'echol, o b'sha'a she'en lo le'echol. And to continue this halacha, if a person eats what he's not supposed to, or if he eats what he was allowed to, but at the wrong time because it's already fully processed, let's say, or he's not actively working, kagon shelo b'shas malacha, such as it's not at the time when he's actively working, areza over mishum lo sigzol o lo signov. Such a person, as we've seen before, is in violation of thou shalt not steal. V'im holich biyado leveso mima sheyesh lo lechol, o shenasan lechol. And if a person further sort of aggravates the violation by not only eating something that he's not supposed to, but taking it to his home, right, mimashi yesh lo lechol o shenasan lechol, or that he. Oh, in other words, here we're talking about, right, anything that you weren't allowed to take. But even if you were allowed to take it, but if you take it home with you, over mishum ve'el kelicha lo siting, you're in violation of the negative commandment of you shall not place it in your container. In other words, you're only allowed to eat it at the workplace. And if you take it home with you, so then you are in violation of placing it in your containers, in other words, putting it in storage. So you could theoretically be in violation of both. You can be in violation of Geneva and in violation of the El Kel Yachal Lo Sitain, do not put it in your containers. So the Imrei Yaakov over here says, Shelo b'shas malacha, And he just refers us back to Sif Chaf Dalid, what is considered to be at the time of work and what is not at the time of work. You have to be actively working. Oh, okay. Let's go on to the next halacha. Chaf Zayin. Ve'eno rashai lechol elamimasha osebo v'lo midavar acher. He says you're only allowed to consume what you're actually working with and not from something else. Okay, afilu scharo lasos bishnehem, and that's true even if, let's say, you were hired by a farmer who's got two different kinds of fields. He's got a vineyard and he's got a wheat field, and he hired you to harvest both. But right now you're working with the wheat field. You can't start nibbling on the grapes. Okay, va'afilu shnehem min echad. And that's true even if they're both the same kind of produce. Kagon botzer gefen zeh lo yochal mi gefen zeh. So, for example, the guy's got two vineyards, and he wants you to do the one vineyard this week, the other vineyard next week. You can't eat from the other vineyard until you get to it. Ele imkein echad mudle al gabe chavera, sha'az nechshavim ke'echad. Unless the vines are so close to each other from each field that they're draped over each other. So in other words, if the vines are draped over each other from both fields, and even if there's a chain link fence between the two, you still consider them to be one field for the purposes of this halacha. V'hadorech begas ad shelo halach shesi va'erev ochel ba'anavim. He says, and if a person is working in the wine press, which is the place where they trample on the grapes. So long as there has not been a complete go over in two different directions with the beam that is used to press the grapes, you're allowed to eat the grapes, but ve'eno shosa tirosh. But you're not allowed to drink any of the juice yet, mipnei she'ein malachto nikeres b'yayin, because you're not considered to be actively working with the beverage. You're still only considered to be actively working with the grape. So you can't start drinking the juice until you've completely pressed the grapes. And that's therefore it's like you're eating another item that you're not actively working with. But mishahalach shesiva erev. But once you've gone over it with the beam in both directions, and they'll explain to us what that means. Shesi va'erev literally means horizontally and vertically. Okay, so then ochel ba'anavim v'shosa b'tiro shemalach l'mikeres b'shneim. Then you're allowed to eat both the grapes that are left over that have been pressed, and you're allowed to drink the beverage, because then it becomes clear that you've actually been working actively with the beverage part as well. Okay. So what does this mean? So we'll take a quick look at the Imrei Yaakov. Kuf mem, below midavar acher, you're not allowed to be eating a different produce than the produce that you're currently working with. The darshinon midichsiv el kel yacholo sitein mamasha atanosin lekelev shel balabayas ata ochel. We learn it out from the words, do not place it in your container, which means you have to place it in your employer's container. So only the produce that you're placing in your employer's container are you allowed to nibble on currently. If you're not currently working with that produce to put it in your employer's container, you're not allowed to nibble on it. Lo yochal migefen zerot salamer migefen acher, you're not allowed to eat from another vine if you're currently working, or from one vineyard over from another vineyard. Ad shelo halach, and then we look. What does he mean? That if it's before you've trampled it, shesi va'erev, both vertically and horizontally. So, in order to understand this, we'll have to explain what the wine presses were like back in the day, which we're not going to do today because we're out of time, because we got to go daven. So we'll just finish this halacha. And I promise you we'll get into more practical stuff as soon as we finish all of the agricultural information. Okay? Yeah, we do have class. Oh, wait a minute. It's a national. Right. So I think we'll pass on tomorrow. I'll send out a WhatsApp that we're not going to learn tomorrow. And we'll pick it up when? Monday? Is that Monday? Not in Canada. So, okay. Have a good day, everybody, and a good